Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. The field before her rippled in the breeze like ocean waves crashing against the shoreline. Flowers dancing among the tall grass and the low hum of cicadas echoed around her. The early morning humidity finally broke, some reprieve from the pressing heat of another Konoha summer. Temari had thought that nothing could compare to the blistering sun in Suna, but, somehow, she found it unusual that small beads of sweat gathered at her temples. Using the back of her hand to wipe it away, she decided to indulge in a quick break beneath the umbrella-like cover of a weeping willow tree that towered above the winding path between her home and the village felt like a second one. Stepping to its trunk and crouching down, she pressed her hands against the cool bed of moss beside it, delicately bordered with small clovers littered with little, white flowers. A little rest couldn't hurt, she mused silently. Temari let her back sink against the forest floor and let out a sigh as she outstretched her hands towards the long, tender leaves that hung from the branches looming over her, slowly closing her eyes. Before leaving Suna to support yet another year's Chunin exams in the Leaf, Gaara had requested for Temari to complete a few additional liaison duties in the nearby villages to help support his treaties and good standing with their leaders. It seemed even as Gaara's tenure as Kazekage endured, his pursuit of peace among the neighboring villages remained top priority. Though the travel was quite dull, Temari was always quick to take on her brother's orders and often found herself truly finding solace in her days alone on the road. A few scrolls delivered here, some gifts and civil duties there, and nearly an entire summer to spend in Konoha on a vacation of sorts. Gaara had grown quite worried of her non-stop travels over the past several years and, while he was quite appreciative of her dedication to her village and to him, he had expressed some concerns and pressed Temari to take time off between her assignments. It's not like he treats Kankuro with kid gloves like this. Temari sighed at the thought, blowing a blonde strand of hair off her forehead. She frowned, realizing that she wasn't quite as alone as she had hoped to be, and began tapping her fingertips against the ground beneath her to get a sense of what entered her vicinity. Though her prowess was wind style, she was able to learn quite a bit from Gaara's sand abilities and grounding techniques in identifying changes in her environment. You stare loudly, Temari's brow furrowed. She opened an eye ever so slightly to see the faint silhouette of a familiar figure leaning over her. His head tilted to the side slowly, much like a dog confused over a cat's meow. Letting someone sneak up on you like this? Someone's rusty, Shikamaru chided, rolling a toothpick from one corner of his mouth to the other as he straightened up. If you were an actual threat, perhaps I'd put up more of a fight. Temari retorted, closing her eye again and raising a hand lazily to gesture him away. He merely raised an eyebrow and pushed his hands into his pockets. The hum of cicadas filled the empty air between them for a moment before Temari continued. Is there a reason you're lording over me? Shikamaru's brow furrowed and he rolled his eyes, again rolling the toothpick across his lips. Tsunade's expecting you. He spoke flatly, fiddling with something in his pocket, and lucky me, I've been assigned escort duty. Temari folded an arm over her face, letting out another loud sigh before rising to her feet. She noticed, for a moment, Shikamaru took a hand out of his pocket as if to offer it for assistance, but he seemed to think better of it and quickly forced it back into his vest. All right, escort away. She gestured to the path ahead and the two fell into a synchronized pace. Another long silence fell between them, only punctuated by the occasional chirping of birds and insects, and the rhythmic thumping of their feet on the ground. Temari glanced up at Shikamaru for a moment, studying him. It had been nearly a year since she had seen him last. Her duties as liaison had kept her away from Konoha for long stretches of time, and whenever she managed to be in town, he was away on some S-rank mission or liaison duties. They were like two ships passing in the night, circumstance keeping them from sharing the same shores. He's taller than I remember, she thought for a moment. I wonder where he got that scar on his lip. Shikamaru's gaze flickered over to meet her own in an instant, and she quickly averted her eyes to avoid him. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, suddenly acutely aware of how long she was looking at staring. If it bothered him, he didn't bring it mention it, and she wasn't about to press her luck to steal another glance. Temari-sama, excellent to see you. I trust Gara as well. Tsunade said, standing as Temari entered her office followed by Shikamaru. No need for honorifics, Lady Tsunade, she held her hands up, feigning embarrassment. He is well and sends his sincerest apologies for his planned absence from this year's exams. Conflicts with some other duties in the land of tea. I'm sure you understand. Tsunade nodded in reassurance before sitting back behind her desk. As always, Konoha is ever grateful for Suna's continued support with the Chunin exams. She began, clasping her hands together with a force that nearly surprised Temari. I understand that you're in the village a bit early for some much-needed time off before the exams begin. I'm sure those days are few and far between, practically a foreign concept. I'll use my time wisely, my lady. Temari bowed her head and let out a small laugh. I'm sure you will. Tsunade smiled and winked to Shikamaru, who let out an audible groan before pressing his open hand across his face. Leave me out of this, I beg you. Shikamaru pleaded, though his request was met with a soft jab from Temari's elbow. What a drag, he murmured, rubbing his side. You two are dismissed for now. Temari, I'll have some scrolls for you in preparation for this year's proctoring tasks delivered to your accommodations in the coming weeks. Shikamaru, please escort Temari to where she'll be staying. Yes, Lady Tsunade, the two said in unison, met with a soft smile from Tsunade before they made their leave. The village streets echoed with the shuttering of shop windows, children's laughter followed by mothers calling them in for supper. Dazzling red and gold streaks arching over the skyline as the sun set slowly over the horizon. Deep purple clouds rolling in the distance over the hills. Temari felt almost delighted by the sights and sounds. Suna was much less lively in the evening in the summer. The heat and sandstorms typically kept most inside this time of year. So, Temari began, clearing her throat. Any missions coming up? Not really, summer's been quiet. Shikamaru shrugged, placing another toothpick in his mouth. Just how you like it, I'm sure. Temari chided, smiling softly though not looking at him. He merely hummed in agreement. He seemed more closed off than usual, but his extroversion tended to ebb and flow regardless of who he spoke with. As they got older, his affinity for mincing words waned, though she could hardly say he was much of a talker when they were kids, either. They arrived at Temari's loft just as the sun fell from the sky. The key Tsunade handed her unlocked the door with a dull thud. The door was quite heavy to open, or perhaps heavy to Temari after her travels these past few weeks. She struggled for a moment before realizing that Shikamaru's hand held it ajar for her, his forearm pressed against the top edge of the door. She mumbled a thanks under her breath and slipped under his arm and through the doorway. Stepping inside, she watched for the briefest of moments the way the moonlight made the dust in the air sparkle. Temari imagined that no one had been in this loft since the last time she visited some months ago. The air still smelled faintly of the spiced tea blend she brought from Suna. Dropping her bags near the first bedroom door, she turned to look at the silhouette in her doorway now holding it ajar with his right side, hands in his pockets. She could just barely see his eyes staring a hole through her. Tea? Temari asked gently. Shikamaru made no motion or sound to accept, but stepped out of his shoes in one smooth motion as he passed over the entryway and let the door shut behind him. She gestured to the small table in the kitchen as she made quick work of lighting the stovetop to brew. Watching him from the corner of her eye, she noticed he used the lighter in his pocket to ignite the 2 candles placed on the table, already partially melted from her last visit. Temari realized that must have been what he was fiddling with. No sugar, Shikamaru finally spoke, his low voice just barely above a whisper. I remember, Temari replied, her voice just as soft. Gently placing the teacup before him and handing him a spoon, knowing he liked to stir the tea regardless. The pair sat again in silence, the blonde watching her own reflection in the tea ripple as she blew on it softly to cool it down. Her gaze flickered up to his, and, if not for the faint light of the candles between them, she could have sworn Shikamaru blushed as her eyes met his. He looked away quickly, his hand grasping the fabric of his pants on his thigh as he absent-mindedly stirred. Tea is best had warm, don't you think? She asked, taking another small sip and raising an eyebrow as she tried to stifle a giggle. His brow furrowed, but he took a long swig before placing the empty cup back on the table. "Attaboy. You're a pain," he asserted, crossing his arms but holding back the corner of his lips from forming a smile. She could have sworn she saw another blush pass over his cheeks. Shikamaru stood up abruptly, pushing his hands back in his pocket. Temari wondered if it was a force of habit or to self-soothe. "I should get going. Need an escort back." Temari let herself giggle this time. "It is getting late." Shikamaru merely rolled his eyes and threw his head back, letting out another groan. "Look," he started, wringing a hand around the back of his neck, "Choji and I are meeting up tomorrow morning for breakfast. Lady Tsunade would kill me if I didn't host the liaison and dignitary of our closest ally. Would you want?" Temari waved him off, crossing an arm across her lap, her other hand loosely fiddling with the handle of her teacup. "Don't feel like you need to put yourself out for me, I'll find my way." "Don't be like that, Shikamaru paused, realizing his tone was harsher than he had intended. He had an air between his teeth, whistling slightly. "You aren't putting me out. I'm asking you if you'd like to join us. I don't want to be a third wheel." She looked down at her nearly empty cup. "It's really all right, I have somewhere to be, anyway. Suit yourself, I'll see you when I see you." He made his leave, tossing a hand up behind him as he made his exit. Temari watched the door long after he left, analyzing the interaction much more than she normally would. She was quite sure why she felt something odd between them. Half-hearted jabs and comfortable silence was the norm between them, but whatever this was. Weird. This feels weird, she thought as she finally rose to her feet, eyes glued to the door. "I wonder if he's seeing someone." Temari's eyes opened naturally with the sunrise, something she hadn't done in what felt like years. Her alarm clock was always set well before the sun would climb over the endless dunes that surrounded her village, so an uninterrupted night's sleep was something she had, quite literally, only dreamed of. She stared into space, watching the light that flickered between the leaves of a tree near her window dance along the ceiling above her bed. In truth, Temari did not have anywhere to be, but felt somewhat guilty at the idea of tagging along in his, or anyone's, day-to-day life. She was the Cage's sister and a political liaison, sure, but she didn't need to be babysat. Perfectly fine being alone, and she didn't need, nor want, special treatment. Besides, intruding on one's plans felt more of a burden than anything else. She finally forced herself to sit up, swinging her feet over the edge of her bed. "Maybe I'll swing by the flower shop," Temari spoke aloud, for no reason in particular other than thinking perhaps speaking her plans into existence would force her to follow through. "I'll see if Ino is in town." Rising to her feet, she stretched side to side and let out a soft groan. She rubbed her shoulder and made her way again to the stove to start some tea. Temari took her time in getting herself ready for the morning, pulling her hair into her typical tight buns and threw on the same black yukata. She seemed to own endless numbers of those. She never find herself growing tired of wearing them. They were flattering and form-fitting, easy to clean. She looked in the mirror for a moment, studying her own reflection. Practical. It wouldn't work. It's not practical, Temari. She thought, brushing her bangs out for the third and fourth time, struggling to get them to sit just right. "You're a liaison, he's a jonin and an aide to the Hokage in his own right. We both have our own duties." She pressed on, reaching for her makeup and stopping just inches before her fingertips touched it. "You have your responsibilities to your village, to your family, and you're concerned about looking cute on the off chance you run into him." She looked again at her reflection. Her tan skin, the small freckles that dotted her nose, the curve of her lips. Scrutinizing. She grasped the edges of the sink, her knuckles turning white. Get a grip, Temari. The tea kettle began to whistle. Finally, she whisked into the kitchen, pressing small studs into her ears as she poured water over her tea. The rest of her routine went smoothly in comparison to her pep talk, putting away the clothes she had neglected to organize the night before and placing her toiletries in their proper locations. Tea and small biscuits on the shelves, alongside a few fruits she had stored in her pouch from the last village she visited. Well, as close to home as I'll get here. Temari pressed her hands onto her hips, trying to find some peace in her meager attempts at organization, and forced herself to smile, though the thought made her feel a bit melancholic. Temari passed through swaths of people just to enter the Yamanaka flower shop. The store was quiet in volume, but busy with customers. It seemed many had the same sense of mind as her. The shop was a quiet escape from the bustle just beyond the doors. The store had expanded in recent years, much beyond the flower arrangements they had been known for. Their newly faceted greenhouse carried dozens upon dozens of species flowers, greenery, and cacti, some of which Temari had become quite familiar with back home. She was sure Medical Ninja loved to peruse the shelves here. The shop was quite beautiful, and Temari made her way slowly browsing the aisles, just taking in the ambience of the well-loved flora. Temari crouched down to look at one small, blooming cactus. She seldom got the privilege to see cacti bloom in Suna. Most never did unless a rainstorm passed through, which was even rarer than one would expect for a literal desert. Its small, delicate red flower looked fragile, yet was a blatant showcase of how not fragile cacti actually are. Weathering the least hospitable environments nature has to offer and still putting in all its effort to bloom the second it can. Prophetic, really, Temari thought, gently cupping a silky petal between her fingertips, careful to not tug on the plant's crowning achievement. Temari. Long time, no see. Temari glanced up to meet the gaze of a familiar blonde. Ino, what a relief it is to see you. She rose quickly to her feet, embracing Ino in a brief hug. What brings you in? A bit early for the Chunin exams, no? Yes, the exams, but my brother wanted me to take some time off beforehand, and what better place than where the village elders can't pester me. Of course, can't run his favorite sister ragged, can he? She raised a hand to her mouth and giggled, shifting her weight slightly to support a large potted plant against her hip. Temari smiled softly at the idea of others noticing Gaara's soft side. Quite a contrast from their childhood years. I'd love to chat longer, Temari, but I'm the only one running the shop today, so I've got to get back to the register. Let's catch up later, maybe I can swing by when you're free. Temari said, gesturing her away as a way of showing her that she wasn't being rude. I'm meeting up with Sakura at 6, I'm sure she'd love to see you. Maybe Tenten if she gets back in time. Meet us here, I'll see you at 6. Temari gave a thumbs up, reassuring Ino with a smile. Temari was, to her fault, half-hearted with her commitments to plans, but did earnestly try her best to actually attend if she directly committed. Before you go, Shikamaru's up front if you want to say hi. Oh, no, that's alright. I'll see him when I see him. Temari waved off her suggestion with a smile, unknowingly parroting what he had said the night earlier. Ino frowned and tilted her head slightly, but didn't press her any further. Confused at her response, but likely more overwhelmed with the sudden rush of customers than anything. Temari slipped out the back door, hoping she could blend in with the crowd. You dolled yourself up for him. Temari pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose between her eyes, and you leave the second he's in the vicinity. She sighed loudly, deciding to just let her legs take her where they took her. She had time to kill, and the further she got away from the epicenter of the village, the more likely she was to create some much-needed distance between her and the man at the flower shop's register. Distance she was, admittedly, not sure she really wanted, but thought for the best. She strolled around the village, poking her head into a few shops that piqued her interest, but eventually gaining some distance between herself and the marketplace. The hustle and bustle of the crowd faded away, only to be replaced by the quiet hum of cicadas and the soft breeze shaking the tree leaves overhead. This sound she found much more comforting. Not quite silence, almost like nature was speaking to her and it was up to her alone to interpret what it said. Houses became further and further apart. Rolling hills covered in expansive family gardens and dense forests surrounded her, but it was still, undoubtedly, Konoha. Temari noticed ahead a small bridge stretching over a winding river between two familial compounds. Two legs dangled over the edge, kicking occasionally but almost as if it were to a tune. Someone just taking it all in, she assumed, but as she approached and was met with yet another familiar face. Naruto, Temari said, her voice almost harmonic as she spoke his name. Naruto looked up to her as if it was the first time he even noticed someone was in his vicinity, flashing her a beaming smile. Temari-chan. He nearly jumped to his feet to hug her tight, then pulled her away from him by her shoulders. How are you? How's Gaara? Here for the Chunin exams, Good. Great, and you got it. Temari spoke through a laugh. Naruto was always happy to see her, even when he barely knew her. That's awesome. Come on, sit. You gotta tell me what else you've been up to. Any good missions lately? Any new skills? I've really beefed up my Rasengan since you and Gaara saw me last. I can't wait to show him next time he's here. He's coming to the exams, right? Temari sat down beside him, dangling her legs over the edge of the bridge as well before responding. Unfortunately not this year. Busy with a few cage things. Temari explained while throwing in some lazy air quotes, knowing she herself couldn't quite get into the specifics simply because Gaara did his best to keep her and Kankuro away from the, to his words, immensely boring political discussions about land and trade. She was quite grateful for his mercy and consideration. That's too bad. Maybe I can convince Granny Tsunade to send me on a liaison trip out to you guys so I can show him, you know. I'm sure he'd love that. Temari smiled again, knowing that her words would hold true. Gaara deeply valued Naruto's friendship, and in turn Temari valued Naruto for seeing him for who he truly was, even when she herself couldn't. So, I also heard congratulations are in order. Oh, yeah, hey, he let out a chuckle, suddenly bashful. Me and Hinata are getting married. She's really the best, you know. She's a good fit for you, Temari said, her voice trailing off. If the moment felt uncomfortable, Naruto didn't seem to notice, but Temari felt swallowed whole by her own desire to ask. Listen, Naruto. How did you know? Know what, exactly? He said, scratching the back of his head and frowning slightly. Just. That Hinata was the person for you. Your person. Temari fumbled, realizing that she had never quite had this sort of conversation with anyone before and wasn't quite sure why she felt the need to have it with Naruto, either. She could lean into the excuse that it was, of course, due to his upcoming nuptials, but Temari knew it was because she was all but desperate to have someone rationalize her swirling thoughts. Naruto leaned back on an arm while pressing his other hand to his chin, seemingly deep in thought. Temari cringed inwardly, not quite sure if she felt worse for Hinata knowing he was taking so long to come up with his reasons or herself for even thinking Naruto would be the one to give her some semblance of clarity on her love life. Maybe she was desperate after all. You know, it's hard to explain. Naruto started slowly, his brow furrowed. I didn't even know Hinata liked me like that. I thought she was just a good friend, always there for me, being kind and supportive even when others weren't. Temari's eye twitched ever so slightly, wondering how the apple of Hinata's eye could have missed all of the painfully obvious signs that everyone but Naruto seemed to have picked up. Hell, even her socially oblivious brothers noticed Hinata's affections for Naruto well before he ever did. But, when I realized, it kinda just hit me. Naruto knocked on his own head. Temari giggled in surprise. She saw me for me. Flaws and all. I know I'm kinda an idiot when it comes to girls, but she really changed how I saw Well, everything, you know. Like, I never really looked at a sunrise before. I mean, I saw it, but one day I saw it. When the sun starts to peek over the horizon and the sky turns that really soft shade of lavender. It reminds me of her eyes and, for a split second every day, I'm surrounded by her. He paused, finally looking at Temari, his look discerning and sincere. I'd give up everything to be surrounded by her forever. Wow, Naruto. That is profound. Well, Pervy Sage was the best writer around. Even if I didn't really get a whole lot of what he wrote about. Must have picked something up from him during our training all those years. Naruto chuckled and blushed, bashful again. Wise man. And you are too. Temari said, nudging his shoulder gently with her palm. Takes a lot to see that and just. No, I guess. Temari trailed off, realizing in that moment that she was dangerously close to sharing her feelings about a certain dark-haired man. Naruto was always a happy guy, despite everything, but he now seemed a different kind of happy. Temari, Naruto started, his voice quieter than before. Do you feel like that about someone, too? Temari began, somewhat startled at the question knowing full well she walked right into it. I think so. I just don't think it would work out. Temari let out, being truthful yet purposefully vague. Well, I'm a Jinchuriki, you know, and I never thought that I'd be in this position. That someone would be able to love me with Kurama inside of me. He's my friend, but it's hard for everyone to understand. But here I am. Naruto leaned his head back, looking again at the sky, the sun slowly dancing over the horizon. He closed his eyes and sighed, seemingly at peace with everything. Maybe what's stopping you isn't as hard to overcome as you think it is. Temari didn't say anything in return and Naruto didn't press any further for answers. If he knew, he didn't let on. She knew he and Shikamaru were close, especially over the past few years, but how much of an open book Shikamaru was remained to be seen. The two sat in silence on the bridge, watching the sun fall into the distance. A lot had changed since the war. Naruto seemed to be almost entirely at peace with himself, his life, his past. Everything in the world he could be worried about, and yet, here he sat, enjoying the dwindling daylight. Naruto, thank you for keeping me company and for your sage-like advice. I think I'll try. Naruto kept his eyes closed, but hummed and smiled in response. Temari paused. You know, I hope this life finds my brothers as well. Temari made her way back to the Yamanaka storefront, Ino just turning off the last of the lights and closing the door behind her, the lock falling into place with a thump. Temari, glad you're tagging along. Sakura said with a cheery grin, poking her head out from just behind Ino's frame. Wouldn't miss it, Temari said, it's not often I get to have some girl time. Or time off. Or a life. Temari gestured flippantly, which was met with a giggle from Ino and Sakura. The trio strolled a short distance down the road to a brightly lit bar. Brushing the curtains aside, Ino pointed to the bartender behind the counter and held up 3 fingers. They nodded with a grin, as the 3 made their way to a booth into the booth seats. Temari faced Sakura and Ino, who met one another's gaze with a look that seemed almost devious. What? Temari started, before Ino held up her hand. What's going on with you and Shikamaru? She stated, not asked, extending her hand out before her as if demanding Temari's response to be packaged and placed in it. Sakura leaned back in her seat, a smile tugging at her lips as she crossed her arms over her chest. What felt like an unending, painful test of wills overcome the group. Temari squirmed in her seat, their piercing gazes on her. I'm not sure what you save it. I've known Shikamaru since we were in diapers and he's never come by my store before looking for me, let alone a plant. A plant? Temari's head tilted slightly to the side, it seemed so obvious once Ino said it aloud, why he was in the shop earlier. Temari had just assumed he was there to see her. Ino frowned at her silence. The second you come into town he's suddenly interested in cacti and how to care for them. Well, let me tell you, I have my doubts that's a coincidence. Ino pressed her finger into the table, brows furrowing as she did so. Their interrogation was interrupted by the bartender sliding in at, Temari could argue, the most tension-breaking, opportune moment. Temari breathed a sigh of relief as he passed around the shot glasses. Suddenly her conversation with Naruto felt like another gear clicking into place in her mind. Maybe the hurdle was all in her head. She finally looked up to the two girls before her, both of whom held up their drinks to cheers. They clinked their glasses, bumping them on the table before shooting them back. Another round. Sakura and Ino cheered in unison. Temari laughed loudly along with them. If you're not going to spill the beans, maybe we should just ask tall, dark and handsome himself. Sakura asked, pressing her finger to her lips with a wink. Temari shrunk into her seat, burying her face into her hands. Guys, please. Temari grumbled into her palms, before slapping them back onto the table before her. If there was anything to tell you, I would. Seriously, it's nothing. Temari, please, please, please believe me when I tell you this. Sakura begged, scooping Temari's hands into hers and cupping them together. If we know anything about Shikamaru, it's his love of doing absolutely nothing, shogi, and him being completely smitten with you. Huge crush, trust me. Ino spread her arms out for comedic effect, the shot clearly hitting her hard as a pink hue flushed across her cheeks. Temari was thankful she had the same excuse, though she could tell her blush was from genuine embarrassment. She wasn't so used to the fanfare of hanging around other women. Gaara had nearly no interest in her personal affairs as far as a love life went in Konkuro's. Konkuro. He'd put her in a headlock and tell her she's too ugly to have a boyfriend if he could. Enough about me, please, I can't handle all this attention. Sakura, what's going on with you and ladies? Tenten appeared before them, throwing her hands in the air, breathing even more life into the party. Tenten. The three women cheered, Temari scooting to the side to let Tenten slide in. Tenten leaned over to give Temari a quick hug before shouting to the bartender for a fourth drink to be added to their next round. We didn't think you'd be able to make it. Ino said, slapping Tenten on her shoulder. Neji and I got back late last night. I was just taking the afternoon to rest up before coming out. So, what did I miss? Tenten beamed. Well, Temari was just about to tell us. Ino grunted as Sakura's elbow made contact with her ribs, Ino's hand slapping the table in pain. Temari was just telling us about how her trip was to the village, and Ino was about to tell us about how things are going with Sai. The girls continued swapping stories, missions, gossip, speaking of family and friends, everything that they had missed over the past few months and then some. Temari regaled all of her travels as a liaison, the girls at the edge of their seats in some moments. Temari had gotten so used to the facets of her job that she neglected to realize that, for some, it was actually exciting and not just dignitary work she'd done a dozen times over. They talked long into the night, shooting back drinks and sake, laughing and shouting, their voices mixing into the larger chorus of the bar. Waving goodbye to Ino, Sakura, and Tenten, Temari unlocked her loft door and slid inside. She pressed her back against the door and slumped against it slightly. She wasn't used to drinking, or spending a late night out doing anything other than her job. Her life was always on the move but was somehow rigid and filled with routine at the same time. She pushed her fingertips against the door behind her to push herself upright and, just as she did so, Temari heard a light tapping on the door behind her. She jumped slightly, quickly pulling open the door thinking it was one of the girls asking to use the bathroom at the last second. Yet, no one stood under the porch light, but a gift placed delicately on the doormat before her. In a small, green pot sat an even smaller cactus with a little red flower. A small, folded note pressed beneath a pebble in the dirt. Temari looked in both directions down the street, but there wasn't a single shadow to be seen. Unfolding the note, she read, Wispy clouds floated slowly across the early morning sky, stars slowly fading out of view as the sun began peeking over the horizon. The air was still with birds not even waking from their slumber. Shikamaru lay against the cool grass, paying no mind to the dew dampening his flak jacket. He rhythmically and methodically flipped open Asuma's lighter, flicking the ignition, lighting the flame, snapping it closed. Flip, flick, light, snap. Again, again, again. Shikamaru often came to the cemetery in the early morning hours, his mind asking questions he knew the dead could never answer. Perhaps that's why it became a routine. He knew there were no answers and he found it easier to be denied clarity from the dead than apathy from the living. He sat up slowly, slipping a cigarette from his front pocket. The sweet smell of tobacco wafting from it as he set it alight and placed it gently on the tombstone next to him. Good talk, Asuma. Shikamaru placed a hand on the grass below it, fiddling the blades between his middle finger and thumb. Finally rising to his feet, he stretched and turned towards the path behind him. The cemetery was, fortunately, always empty this early in the day. Grief tended to hit most at night, in empty homes and empty beds, but Shikamaru felt it the worst in the mornings. He and Shikaku tended to play shogi at daybreak as his mom prepared breakfast, his old man often scolding him for his laziness and lack of drive, pushing him to train harder, work harder, think of the future. But the shogi board now sat in the den, covered in a thin layer of dust. His normal routine, shaken by something as trivial as death. Yet, he hadn't visited his father's grave since his passing. Shikamaru had visited Asuma nearly every day he was in the village, but made it a point to avoid the end of the cemetery where his father rested. It wasn't denial, Shikamaru was all too aware, but if he didn't visit, he could somehow pretend that his father was away. He was just on a mission. He was just too busy to be home. He was with mom at her sister's house. He was an important man, he just couldn't be around. Perhaps that's why he never put the shogi board away, they would pick back up on their match when he got back. He lifted a cigarette to his lips. Flick, flip, light, snap. Inhale, exhale. Rhythmic. Routine. Shikamaru liked routine. He liked knowing what to expect, yet he found his mind wandering to the most unpredictable, difficult woman he could have chosen to orbit around, and orbit he did. Temari was a force of nature, drawing him in by her mere presence. She was, by his definition, incredibly troublesome. Always pushing his buttons, always finding a way to tease him. His brow furrowed, pulling smoke into his throat. He kept her at arm's length, always. Sure, he orbited, but never collided, never approached. Shikamaru would only ever admit to himself, in the cloak of morning solitude, that he was deeply afraid of the collision. He wanted to know her in a way he denied others from knowing him. But they were too deeply connected to their villages, their lives, their responsibilities. So he flirted in absence of being able to do much else, sometimes more than he meant to, and she'd leave. The dust would settle, and the routine would start again. Never getting too close. Orbiting. But here she was, for an unavoidable amount of time, and he feared he couldn't draw out the routine for that long. The dust wouldn't settle. He wanted her in a way that made his chest ache. He knew she could pick up on his distance the night before last. He knew she was avoiding him now. He knew, she knew. Inhale, exhale. What a drag. Shikamaru laid back against the hill, his leg crossed over his knee, his arms behind his head like a pillow. Fluffy white clouds floated to the east, he studied each one carefully, almost hoping to see something that would redirect his thoughts, give him some motivation to do something, anything at all, to keep his mind occupied. But the clouds remained silent, damning him to listen to his feeble brain flounder over how to talk to some girl for the next couple of months. Shikamaru wanted to have another cigarette to ease his woes but thought better of it, placing a toothpick against his teeth to rapidly roll across his lips. Shit. He groaned, I'm so foo. Thought I'd find you here, the devil herself spoke, leaning over him suddenly like he had done to her on her way into the village. Shikamaru nearly jumped out of his skin, his overreaction actually startling Temari. Geez, Temari. Shikamaru clutched at his chest through his flak jacket. It was prophetic, in his mind, how much they mirrored one another. Perhaps the orbit was mutual. Scared the shit out of me. Clearly. She let out a soft laugh before pointing to the ground beside him. Can I sit? He nodded as he closed his eyes, realizing he was backed into a corner here. If he left now, it would be painfully obvious he was avoiding her, which he truly didn't want to do but felt he needed to. Self-preservation, he believed earnestly. But the best he could do was avoid looking at her. Listen, Shikamaru, she began, her voice melted him. He desperately wanted to hear her say his name again, again. Do you want to come over for dinner tonight? I'm not a great cook, but we can do takeaways or something. Only if you're not busy. I feel like I owe you for the gift. I'm not busy, Shikamaru said almost a half-second too quickly. Smooth. I can pick something up. Terrible recovery. Temari didn't speak, but Shikamaru heard her shifting to lie down next to him. His heartbeat erratic, admonishing himself both for agreeing without thinking and sounding desperate. He couldn't articulate why this song and dance was becoming more and more of a struggle for him. They had been friends, or whatever one would call this, for years. This routine of theirs wasn't new, but he relished in the indulgence every time. Thrill of the chase. Shikamaru could swear he was an addict. Every time he got a taste, he wanted more. He wanted her. Her weight shifted again, he could feel her staring at him. What are you looking at? Shikamaru drawled, keeping his eyes closed. Just. Why did you get me a gift, anyway? What? I can't just do something nice. Shikamaru countered, his voice tense, because he knew this line of questioning was going to get him into trouble. He, boy genius, didn't actually know why he had done it. I can't say I recall the last time you did anything nice. Temari laughed, seeming to enjoy teasing him. I do nice things all the time, Shikamaru said, opening his eyes in frustration. He could feel a blush crawling across his cheeks. She had propped her head on the heel of her hand, her eyes half closed as she looked at him. She was close to him, painfully close. He could cross the distance in a second, but instead closed his eyes again in an attempt to avoid the gaze that bore through him. Shikamaru used his middle knuckle to tap on her door, looking down at the small bag of takeaway noodles from a hole-in-the-wall shop he and Choji had found years ago and just kept making a habit of returning to any time they wanted some comfort food. They went nearly every day after returning from the war. Comfort was in high demand back then. For the briefest moment, Shikamaru had thought he had dreamed of their interaction earlier that day, a prolonged silence within the walls of her apartment, but he soon heard a quiet shuffling, approaching footsteps, the lock clicking open. Hey! Temari opened the door, Shikamaru somewhat taken aback at her standing in just a t-shirt and shorts, not the usual yukata she wore. Suddenly shy, she slipped her frame behind the door ever so slightly before gesturing inside. Come on in, I'm making some tea. The loft smelled like her. Vanilla, jasmine, spices that he couldn't quite identify. It was warm, inviting, comfortable. Small windows into her life were scattered around. A couple of bracelets on the counter, a weathered photo of her and her two brothers when they were clearly much younger, a small bag of whole, sweet chestnuts. Shikamaru leaned against the doorway leading into the kitchen as she poured the hot water from the kettle into the teapot, stirring for a moment before letting it steep. Her movements were slow, careful, deliberate, like an artist calculating their next brush stroke. She reached to an upper cabinet, the bottom of her shirt rising just enough to expose some of her bare stomach. Shikamaru looked away quickly, his face reddening as he rubbed the back of his neck. Why don't we eat in the other room? She stated more than asked. Shikamaru shrugged, again making another feeble attempt to keep his composure. His heart still thumped wildly as he wandered to the small tea table in the den. He rubbed his fingertips against his chest hoping to force it to settle. Temari followed a moment after, carrying their respective teacups and placing one before him. No sugar. Sliding over her share of the food, Shikamaru tore open a pair of chopsticks. Carefully separating them, he quickly rolled them together to make them smooth before handing her a pair and sliding her meal over to her in tandem. What a gentleman, she mused, peeling open her container to reveal what she could argue was her first good meal in months. You guys really don't play about food, huh? Well, I think I've been to every restaurant in the village multiple times over with Choji and Ino, and Asuma. Shikamaru said, rubbing his own chopsticks together. If Temari hadn't been paying attention, she would have missed the slight drop in his voice. His eyes were darker than she remembered. Grief was a unique experience for everyone. Is that who you were visiting in the cemetery today? Temari asked, pulling a noodle into her mouth. Yeah, I try to visit him as often as I can. Shikamaru said, quietly. My mom gives me a lot of grief over not visiting my dad. I don't know. I can't. He wasn't sure why he was sharing this with her. It's almost like the words spilled out of him. He couldn't tell if it were because he felt comfortable enough around her, or that he really needed to talk about it. It sounds like you had a good relationship with him, with your dad. Temari added, taking a sip of her tea. Yeah, I do. I did. I mean. Shikamaru kept reminding himself to use the past tense but found the task often too difficult to make a habit of. Gravestones, tombs, they're for the living. Not for the dead, so we have some place to go when we need to see them. Temari said, picking at another noodle with her chopsticks. I think. When you need to talk to him most, you'll find your way. When did you get so prophetic? Shikamaru asked, setting his half-empty container to the side in place of a teacup. I've done a lot of reading while traveling these past few years. I'm usually alone, so it was always a good way to pass the time. You should try it sometime. Do some thinking. She pointed her chopsticks at him. He met her with a blush and a smile. Somehow her scolding felt comforting. I do enough thinking. I don't think I need anything to motivate me to do more of it. He leaned back against the couch behind him, resting his elbows on top of the cushions. The more he sat with her, the more he thought that he could do this every night. Just them, catching up over dinner. Shikamaru felt so selfish in that moment, as if he wanted to keep her all to himself. What were you thinking about today, when I found you? Temari asked, noticing Shikamaru drawing himself back in defensiveness. She wasn't quite sure how to read his body language. She rose to her feet, gesturing towards the room over. Do you want a drink? Like a drink? I'm not much of a beer guy. Shikamaru said, breathing a silent sigh of relief at how easily she gave him an out. Who said anything about beer? Temari mused from the kitchen, rounding the corner with a tall brown bottle and two small glasses. God, Temari, I feel like I barely know you. Bourbon? Shikamaru asked, gladly taking the glass she poured for him. He relaxed almost the second the drink hit his lips, but immediately stiffened as she sat next to him. He could smell her perfume, her hair. She noticed how tan her skin was, the nearly invisible freckles that dotted along her nose, how green her eyes were in the candlelight. The tiniest mole on her knee, how soft the skin on her thigh looked. What the hell is in this bourbon? Shikamaru's eyes widened slightly, looking at his glass. I've never been a secret, Shikamaru. Temari said as she leaned towards him. She was again painfully close to him, her knee nearly brushing against his thigh. So, what were you thinking about? Just things. He couldn't fathom honesty in that moment. She was too close, he didn't trust himself to not close the distance. To keep his orbit. To not collide. Things. Temari mirrored, crossing her arms over her chest. Shikamaru was desperate to stop this line of questioning. He needed a cigarette. He needed a taller drink, maybe even a stronger one. He needed to leave this room that felt 10 degrees warmer now than when he walked in. Yes, things, he said, fiddling with his earring. Pray tell, what things could Shikamaru Nara be thinking about? Temari asked, spinning the glass in her hand, watching the brown liquid swish around. Well. He paused, feeling like he was seconds away from smoke literally pouring from his ears as the gears turned in overdrive. You know, thinking of a gift for Naruto and Hinata, them getting married and all. And then Neji and Tenten got together. Tenten just told me yesterday. Makes perfect sense, she said, closing her eyes and smiling, her face dream-like. Does it? Shikamaru asked, genuinely perplexed. He had never looked at Neji as the boyfriend type. He wasn't quite sure he looked at Neji as the anything type. Yeah, I mean, they've been teammates forever. They go on missions together all the time, sometimes just them. I think, with proximity, the more time you're with someone, you just start to feel connected. You love them because they see behind the curtain, what goes on in your head. What makes you happy, what you fear. And, Temari paused, thinking about what she and Naruto had spoken about the day before. Whatever walls you built aren't as hard to climb over as you think they are. You sure you haven't been reading romance novels? Shikamaru asked, gently bumping a fist against her shoulder. You're so annoying. I'm serious. I think they make a good couple. Sure, Tenten is extroverted and boisterous and Neji is stoic in all business, but they seem to balance each other out well. She balled her fist. Then, much to Shikamaru's surprise, took his hand and rested it over hers. Yin and yang, you know. Yin and yang, Shikamaru parroted, looking down at his hand over hers. He felt his eyes soften, the walls she spoke about seconds before crumbling. For the first time since the day he discovered the art of laying in the grass and watching clouds roll by, he wanted this second to last an eternity. Her hand was so small, completely enveloped by his. Without thinking, without even wanting to, he slowly turned her fist over in his hand and brushed his thumb over her fingers, pulling each one back until her hand was open. Shikamaru finally looked up at her, her green eyes wide, ready to swallow him whole. He stretched his fingers over hers, lacing them together. Whatever resolve he had was waning rapidly. He didn't just want to orbit, or collide, he wanted to be swallowed by the sun. It's late. I should get going. Shikamaru finally broke the silence, brushing his thumb over their interwoven fingers. Temari merely hummed, seemingly not willing to agree but knowing he was right. He let more time pass, their hands still molded together. Somehow he knew the inevitable was coming and that she did too. What they had been avoiding for years now but just lay beyond the horizon. This summer would be fun. They would play house and they would let their walls down enough to get much too close and then she would leave. Time and distance keeping them apart. He'd write her, knowing she'd only write back once or twice. Busy. Traveling. Liaison duties. He'd stop writing, not out of anger, but because he got busy too. Life marches on. She'd be back for a few days, maybe a week or two. They'd cling to each other, desperately, wanting time to stop. But it wouldn't. Not for them. Eventually they would fall out of touch, she'd be in town and he'd be busy. They'd see other people, they'd settle down with their own families and own lives. This would be fleeting memory, but not one he would dwell on. Listen, Kiba's having a get-together tomorrow night. I'm sure everyone would love to see you there. He said, finally mustering the will to separate his hand from hers. Temari's thoughts seemed to swirl all night, her stomach in complete knots, a mixture of excitement and dread. This had been brewing for years, always threatening to spill over but time and duty kept things from boiling. But now she had no buffer, no barriers, no distractions. Her dreams were fleeting visions, not just of him, but of her home, her brothers, places she had traveled, glimpses of the war. Nothing meaningful. She woke to the sound of a telephone ringing somewhere in the loft. She had forgotten that she had access to one while staying in Konoha. A modern luxury she seldom even bothered herself with back in Suna. Temari sighed, swinging her legs over the edge of her bed and stretching as the phone's ring continued to echo through the apartment. She hoped, briefly, That once the ringing stopped that she could go about her morning, but those hopes were dashed as the ringing began again a few moments later. Hello. Temari answered as she finally found the source, interrupting the ring mid-note. She rubbed the last winks of sleep from her eyes. God. Took you long enough. A gruff voice carried over the line, impatient like he always was. What do you want, Konkuro? Nothing. Nothing. Just checking in to make sure you made it in one piece is all. Temari rolled her eyes. She was sure he only called at Gaara's insistence, but knew that he would have called eventually anyway. He would never admit to caring, let alone missing her, yet she'd often come home from her extended travels to find notes in her office, hidden amongst her things. Little drawings, stupid comments about her poor organizational skills, wondering how she could find anything. I'm in one piece. How's everything? Same old, same old. You're not missing much, honestly. Change of plans, though. I'll be out there in a few weeks to help with the Chunin exams. Matsuri's on guard duty with Gaara while they're in the land of tea. Konkuro said as she heard the soft thump of his feet landing on his desk as he leaned back in his chair. Temari scoffed at the suggestion. The last time Gaara had been without one of them for any extended period of time, he quite literally died. And we think that's safe? Temari asked tentatively, her tone dripping of concern. Gaara pushed, and who am I to deny the generosity of my dearest baby brother? Sides, I think he wants alone time with Matsuri. Konkuro's voice was audibly suggestive, knowing full well it would make his sister cringe. It was hard for Temari to watch her brothers grow up, become men in their own right. For the longest time it was just them against the world. Ugh, gross. Temari groaned. Fine, if you think she's up to the task, not like I can do much from here. Ironic that's your take considering Gaara sent you all the way out there to spend the summer with your boyfriend. What's his name again? He's not my boyfriend, Temari said, her voice raising slightly as she spoke his name, her finger subconsciously twisting around the phone wires. She pulled her hand to her side the moment she noticed her own fidgeting, her brows tensed, almost angry at herself for her overreaction to the suggestion. Yet you knew exactly who I'm talking about. Come on, Temari, you're making it too easy. Konkuro said with a laugh, his fingertips drumming against his desk. He was a middle child, through and through, and a well-seasoned one at that. Are we done here? Temari asked, sighing. Yeah, I've had my fill of bullying you for the day. I'll call in a couple weeks, let me know if you need me to bring anything before I head out. I'll think about it later, Temari said, and the other line clicked as Konkuro hung up. Temari pressed her phone to the receiver and leaned back in the chair she had slid into at some point during their conversation. The distraction brought her no peace. Her thoughts continued to swirl. How is she, Konkuro? Gaara asked, not looking up from the paperwork that littered his desk, most of which were covered in barely legible notes in his own handwriting. Fine. I don't think she'd tell me if she wasn't, but she sounds in high spirits. Konkuro said, leaning against the doorway. He crossed his arms, watching Gaara take his time combing through the documents. He was used to this, Gaara's often painstakingly long response time. Everything he said, everything he did, carefully thought through before execution. It's what made him into the well-respected leader that he was, but failed to make him an ideal conversationalist. Good, he said, finally looking up from his papers, the tip of a pen pressed between his lips. I hope she takes advantage of her time off. Sounds like she's trying to take advantage of someone. Konkuro added, wiggling his eyebrows at his brother and Matsuri, standing guard, who made every attempt to stifle her uncomfortable groan. Gaara merely raised an eyebrow, unwilling to engage in the conversation further. He respected the boundaries his sister placed. She didn't wish to discuss her dating life with her siblings, and Gaara refused to pry further. If she wanted him to know, she would share, but until then Gaara was the unfortunate recipient of his elder brother's innuendos. Konkuro, can you prepare the board room? He stated more than asked. We have a meeting with the village elders later this afternoon and, you know how they are. He added, pressing a finger to his temple. As the fourth cage, Gaara was as much a victim of age-old traditions as his father, and the cage before him. That I do, Kankuro said, pushing his shoulder off the doorway he leaned against. I'll leave you to be. He winked pointedly as he exited, closing the door behind him. Gaara sighed, leaning back in his chair before looking to Matsuri. Gave her some time off, she asked, stepping forward towards his desk. My sister is tired. She's been traveling on my behalf for quite some time. She deserves some rest and I know she wouldn't be able to do so if she were here. He said as he rose from his seat, turning towards her. Matsuri nodded, closing the distance between them. You deserve some rest, too, she said, smoothing the collar of his cloak and brushing the fabric down his chest. Gaara frowned, seemingly worried he had upset her. We'll be able to have some time together later this month. I'm sorry things have been busier than I was expecting, he said softly. Ash took her hands into his. There was an almost unrecognizable softness to his voice. The edge, the sharpness to his tone. He was often known for melting away the longer he spoke. It's part of the job, Matsuri said, squeezing his hands in return. I knew what I signed up for. Gaara was unconvinced of her acceptance of the situation, knowing full well the weight of being a cage placed on personal relationships. A steep cost and significant sacrifice. He had kept her at arm's length for some time, in fear of burdening her with what came as the consequence of being with him, among other things. Still, I don't want you to think I don't want to be with you more often. Gaara paused, moving his hand to cup her cheek and brushing his thumb down her jaw. I would do nothing else, if I could. I know. Matsuri tilted her head into his hand, smiling softly. I can't believe how many applicants there are this year, Shizune said, flipping through seemingly endless folders on her desk. Nearly double compared to last year. Shikamaru hummed in agreement, hunched forward in his chair reading through trial documents. He recognized a few names, children of his parents' friends, children and grandchildren of well-respected village elders, wielders of Kekkei Genkai, both familiar and unfamiliar. He had his bets, those he felt would make it through the first and second rounds of the exam, and a few wild cards he thought had a chance. Even an underdog, perhaps those who hadn't done particularly well on the exam, but something about them felt capable. He knew he was the last person who should be judging exam scores of all things. Shikamaru didn't find it to be an adequate assessment of intelligence or skill. It was really just a testament to which kids could sit down, shut up, and regurgitate information that wound up never being useful in actual combat. Well, I think I'm going to call it quits for the day. I don't think I could read another page without my eyes falling out of my head. Shizune laughed, turning to Shikamaru. Do you think you'll head out, too? I've got a few more things to look into, but I'll be done soon. Don't worry, I'll lock up, Shikamaru said, not looking up from the file he was combing over as he waved her off. Enjoy your afternoon, Shizune smiled, bowing her head in appreciation as she exited, closing the door behind her. Tauntaun's excited squeals echoed down the hallway. Shikamaru pulled out a few more folders, making some annotations along the headers. Until taking this position, he hadn't realized how much effort each sensei had actually put into submitting their students' applications for the exams. Pages upon pages of mission reports, reviews of skills, tenacity, problem-solving abilities, ability to work as a unit. Briefly, he wondered what Asuma had to say about him, Ino, and Choji, what he thought of them all those years ago. These punk kids, barely a notch under their belt, looking to test skills they had barely been able to hone. He smiled, thinking of the dinner they had together the night before the exams began, Asuma and his wallet silently panicking over Choji's dedication to really enjoying what he said could be his last meal. He clicked his pen again and again, lost in thought. Maybe I'll duck out too, he thought as he glanced out the window to see the perfectly white and fluffy clouds passing over the mountains on the horizon before looking back to mountains of files that sat untouched. Not like Tsunade's in a rush to review these. Shikamaru made his way out of the Hokage mansion, taking his time walking down the steps towards his family's compound. He typically didn't bother going straight home, he didn't find much enjoyment about going back to an empty house. Since the war and his father's passing, his mother moved in with her sister on the other side of the village and Shikamaru was the last of his clan to care for the forest and the deer. He felt it a duty to stay, he felt it his responsibility to carry on. Shikamaru's eyes opened slowly, the back garden slowly coming into focus. Evening birds chirped, the low hum of frog calls and crickets starting to whine as the sun set. The clouds in the distance were deep purple, threatening rain in a stark contrast to the golden hue of the mountains behind them. He stretched as he sat up from the deck floor. He dreamed of his father often, the last things he said. As the years passed, he had forgotten his voice, his bad habits, the way he showed how much he loved him and his mom, even when he did say it. He sometimes felt so angry because his grief was so deeply woven into him, he wasn't sure if he would ever be whole without it. He wasn't sure if he would ever be without it. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them and resting his chin on the back of his hand, letting out his turmoil in a long, measured sigh. Should probably head out, he thought, realizing that the longer he waited, the less likely he was to actually go. Shikamaru quickly rose to his feet and pulled his undershirt back on, not bothering with his flak jacket. The hair that had fallen to his shoulders now pulled back into its usual tie. He patted his pockets, checking for his lighter but mostly ensuring he had a cigarette somewhere on him. He liked it as a convenient excuse to step outside, which often let him leave without much fuss from Kiba. "I'll be out late," his voice echoed back at him. He wondered, briefly, why he still spoke to the space between the floorboards, but they creaked in response as he walked over them and out the door. Perhaps the world around him spoke to him in a language he had yet to translate. The air in the loft was hot, humid, nearly claustrophobic. Every room packed with shinobi, both friends and strangers to Temari. She could hear Ino's laugh echo from down the hallway, Choji yelling about something she couldn't quite make out. In the far corner of a room she could see Tenten tucked under Neji's arm, laughing at whatever story Lee was retelling with exaggerated gestures and movements. More strangers, faces who seemed familiar, perhaps those she had fought alongside during the war but none that she recognized in the moment. Things happened quickly, there was no time to dwell on the names of those who were unsure she would even see on the other side. Temari managed to make her way through the groups of people that congested the apartment. Voices were loud, undoubtedly drunk. Laughter, swearing, a haze wafted through the air. She rounded the corner to see Kiba, pouring himself what was clearly not his first drink. He grinned, canines pearly white. Kiba passed her a glass, clinking his own against hers quickly before taking a swig. Temari laughed, his inebriation contagious. "Glad to see you made it, Mari," Kiba commented, his eyes hazy and words passing over his lips with a barely noticeable slur. She had never given him explicit permission to give her what was clearly a pet name, but she was a tactician through and knew when to choose her battles. She doubted it would change anything even if she did make a fuss. He seemed to do what he pleased when it pleased him. He may even find more delight in the idea that his actions annoyed her. "That I did. Have you seen Shikamaru?" Kiba asked, smiling again with a wink, thinking he was filling in the unspoken gaps in her words. "Sakura," Temari said, pointing her index fingers at him in correction. She wanted to find the local lazy genius, but she wanted to at least pretend that everything was casual. Nothing serious, nothing meaningful, nothing she needed to worry herself with. Kiba didn't seem entirely convinced by her redirection but didn't push it. In the living room, to the right, by the back door. "Can't miss her." He made a shooing gesture as he sent her along. Temari stuck her tongue out at him, to which he retorted by giving her the finger. Temari couldn't help but like Kiba. He reminded her of Kankuro in a lot of ways. Crass, wild, unapologetically himself, others be damned. Temari squeezed between more house guests, more familiar faces without names. The smell of booze and cigarettes. Sakura. Temari shouted over the blare of the music and loud conversations, her voice barely drawing the attention of the kunoichi hardly a meter away from her. Temari. Sakura returned her excitement, pulling on Temari's arm to squeeze her between two people and pulling her into a hug. Is it always this crazy? Temari asked, gesturing vaguely behind her. Mostly. I think more people showed than usual considering we're celebrating Naruto and Hinata. Sakura laughed, throwing air quotes around celebrate. I think Kiba just wanted an excuse to party. I'm sure. Temari laughed. Where are they, anyway? Sakura merely pointed towards the center of the room as she had her drink pressed to her lips. Across the room, Naruto sat on the ugliest green couch Temari had ever seen. Hinata sat on his lap, arguably more beautiful than in recent memory. It was like they were the only two in the room. People shouting, drinks spilling, laughter, conversations, yet Naruto's arm was wrapped tightly around Hinata's waist and he spoke to her so gently, his eyes glossed over like she was a sun and all he could see was her. Her long hair framed her face, her features barely visible except the softest smile on her lips. He pressed his forehead to hers, her shoulders vibrating with laughter. Wow, Temari said, imagine being that in love. It's sickening. Sakura groaned, though Temari could tell that she was profoundly happy for Naruto. Her eyes were filled with admiration, the love of a sister, or as close as it could be to one. One day. For both of us. So, what's going on with you? Temari asked, her voice tentative as she chose her words carefully. Most didn't make any attempt to broach the subject of love with Sakura after the war. Sasuke had disappeared again and, despite her insistence that she had long since moved on from her childhood love, she had turned down nearly every attempt at a relationship anyone made with her, keeping most at arm's length. Sakura had mentioned over drinks the other day that she had gone on some dates here and there, one of them being with Kiba a few years prior, much to Temari's surprise. She merely said that they were too different, but Ino alluded that Kiba was too much of an all-or-nothing person and Sakura wasn't quite there yet at the time. Commitment still felt like betrayal, and she may have held out some sort of hope that Sasuke would return. But, it had been years of no word and her hope had waned. Nothing but. She paused as she took in a deep breath and a long sip of her drink before continuing, I think I'm ready. Actually, genuinely ready. Something in Temari felt that she was telling the truth, and not just to placate others at their insistence that she should just be happy. The assertion was almost insulting, really, because who wouldn't want to just be happy? Going to give Kiba another shot? Temari asked, raising her eyebrows and winking. Sakura seemed to ponder for a moment, pressing a fingertip to her chin before shaking her head. I'm pretty sure he's got his eyes on someone else, but you know how he is, he'd probably entertain it, but that ship has sailed. He'd flirt with a street lamp if it'd give him the time of day. Temari shook her head and scoffed. Sakura burst out in laughter, grabbing Temari's arm to steady herself as tears formed in the corners of her eyes. You're spot on, Temari, I swear. She dabbed at her eyes, trying to keep the tears from spilling over her flushed cheeks. Let's go grab another drink, I know where Kiba keeps the good stuff, none of that jungle juice or whatever he calls it. Sounds from Kiba's party were audible well before his loft even came into view. The thumping bass of whatever music was playing vibrated the ground as he approached. He tucked his lone cigarette behind his ear, instead opting to press a toothpick between his teeth. He couldn't waste his ace in the hole to escape the cramped confines of Kiba's living room on his brisk walk there. Shikamaru often arrived at these gatherings as they were already well underway, knowing that he could avoid most conversations if no one noticed his arrival, though there was at least one person's attention he hoped to attract. He was still committed to acting casual, but found himself unable to untie the knot that started to twist in his stomach. He was a grown man getting butterflies over holding hands with a girl. It felt so childish and troublesome, yet there the feeling was demanding his full attention, no matter how hard he tried to suffocate it. He dragged his hands down the front of his face in exasperation before he pulled the sleeves of his shirt from his wrists to his elbows, silently cursing that he hadn't dressed a little less warm considering how packed this loft would inevitably be. Shikamaru's pace slowed as he approached the door, taking a few deep, measured breaths before entering. Just as he imagined, the room was nearly overflowing, the air thick with the smell of booze and whatever he knew Shino was habitually smoking in his room. The room was unbelievably humid and he groaned as he could already feel sweat beading at the center of his back. He pressed through the crowd, doing his best to avoid direct contact with anyone but often had to all but force his way past several. Fortunately, as he had planned, most ignored him, either too drunk or too invested in their own conversations to be bothered. Shikamaru finally breezed through the entryway into the kitchen, knowing that the room would be the least congested. "My man," Kiba shouted, slapping his hand to shake and pulling him in close for a brief hug before he started pouring him a drink, nearly overflowing a glass with some sort of brown liquor. "Need some?" "Yup," Shikamaru groaned loudly, reaching for the glass before Kiba even finished pouring and downed it. He winced slightly at the burning sensation in his nose before he wiped at the edges of his mouth with his thumb and slapped the glass back onto the counter. He tapped 2 fingers next to the glass, all but demanding more, to which Kiba responded with another heavy pour. "Shit. What's with you?" Kiba's gaze passed from Shikamaru, looking particularly shaken up, to Sakura and Temari as they slinked through the crowd from the room over. "Ha, ha, oh man, what a momentous occasion. I can't believe I'm watching her get you all hot and bothered in real time." His grin widened by the second, his lips curling devilishly to reveal his canines. Shikamaru shot him a dirty look, followed by a pleading one to Shino as he entered the kitchen. "Don't look at me, I didn't even know he knew what the word momentous meant." Shino quipped as he shrugged, which produced a genuine laugh from Shikamaru. Kiba grit his teeth, readying some sort of defense about being well read, but he seemed to drop the fight as soon as the 2 women entered the room. His devilish grin returned, glancing at Shikamaru quickly before returning his attention to the women. "Sakura, Mari, my 2 favorite ladies," he said, his voice smooth as he delicately picked up a hand from each of them. "Do you say that to all the girls?" Sakura asked, raising an eyebrow as Shino poured some liquor into her and Temari's glasses. Kiba dropped their hands and clasped his own together in earnest, shaking his head in denial, only to be almost immediately betrayed by Shino nodding a silent affirmation. Temari let out a long laugh, grabbing at her sides that cramped almost immediately. "Recycled material, Kiba, what a shame. I really thought you better than that," she scolded, met with yet another finger from Kiba. Temari pretended to be shocked, pressing a hand loosely to her chest. "Forget you guys," Kiba scoffed, before looking to Shino and raising pinched fingers to his lips. Shino merely nodded, fishing through his pockets as the pair made their way towards the back door. Sakura eyes trailing them closely, shaking her head before looking back to Temari. "We should probably supervise. I don't trust Kiba to not do something moderately dangerous," Sakura said, holding her hand out to Temari, which she gladly took. As she began leading them back towards the crowd of people, Temari looked up to Shikamaru. He remained silent as he met her gaze for just a moment before looking down to the drink in his hand, a pink hue creeping across his cheeks. She wasn't sure if he had too much to drink already or if it was just the heat of the room. Neither would have surprised her. At the last second, she managed to grab his hand, catching him by surprise as she pulled him along to snake through the crowd. "Come on," she said, her voice almost a giggle. His heart caught in his throat. Her fingers loosely wove through his, he followed her through the crowd. Shikamaru knew he was in dangerous territory. Like this, he'd follow her anywhere. In his efforts to not focus so much on her figure as she pulled him along, he desperately clung to the sound of the music as they passed by the stereo system, picking up the faint words between the chatter of those around him. You can be all I've got, what's the difference? You and me and a lot of bad decisions. His brow furrowed at how unfortunately prophetic he found the words, but something in his chest swelled with conviction, suddenly remembering an ages-old conversation with his old man over a long game of shogi, something about the universe, calling, for him to be a strategist. But now the universe was calling again and it demanded an answer. Would he rather make bad decisions with her, or good ones with anyone else? The five ninja filtered out onto the balcony, the night air noticeably cooler than inside the loft. Shikamaru pulled at the front of his shirt a few times as he shut the glass door behind them, dissipating some of the heat and sweat that beaded against his chest. The chill was a relief, helping quell some of his racing thoughts. Would he rather make bad decisions with her, or good ones with anyone else? Shino leaned against the corner of the railing, lighting up something that was decidedly very much not a cigarette. He took a deep inhale, letting the smoke slowly roll out of his mouth as he offered it to Kiba, who obliged with an equally deep drag. Temari? Kiba asked through held breath, followed by a long series of coughs. She held up a hand and shook her head to decline. He rolled his eyes and mouthed baby, before offering it to Sakura with a wink. She seemed to think better of it for a moment before accepting, taking a small puff and passing to Shikamaru, much to Temari's surprise. He took a long drag, smoke billowing from his mouth as he handed it back to Shino. He looked to Temari quizzically as she shook her head at him. I seem to learn new things about you all the time. She laughed and leaned back against the railing as she looked up to him, her nose scrunching up as she did so. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut, almost overwhelmed by her presence, the smell of liquor on her lips, the way her eyes looked even more blue and green under the moonlight. He'd gladly drown in an ocean of that color, though he wasn't sure which inebriation was influencing that desire. I'm not that hard of a read. Shikamaru mumbled, resting his elbows on the railing next to her. He could hear his pulse in his ears. He took another deep breath and wrung his hands together, hoping to get some semblance control. He was losing his grasp on the orbit. Well, you're certainly not an open book, she said. Her voice went quiet, matching his tone. You know that's not true. Do I? She asked with another laugh, leaning her head onto his shoulder so slowly he almost didn't notice its weight pressed against him. Shikamaru glanced to his left to look at her again and was suddenly, very acutely aware that they were alone on the balcony. The sliding glass door hung open slightly. He silently cursed Kiba, knowing this was absolutely orchestrated and, at that moment, the smoke and alcohol hit him. All control evaporating, all the walls he had built felt like they were crumbling. I think you do. Shikamaru stood upright as he spoke, his voice smooth and low, laced with inebriation. Shifting his stance to be directly in front of her, he hung his head down slightly, his face inches from hers. He was unbelievably close to the edge of every bad decision he wanted to make. With her. Only her. He knew it couldn't last, but it didn't matter. The orbit. His resolve was gone. Being casual. He placed his hands on the railing to either side of her. His eyes were hooded as he looked down at her, his face inches from hers. The finger Temari had pressed against his chest was now her whole hand, grasping the front of his shirt, to both pull him in closer and to control the distance between them. He was radiating heat. She wanted him, or perhaps needed him. She wanted the heat. She wanted an inferno. Shikamaru, she whispered, her voice suddenly hoarse. She didn't meet his eyes, staring only at his mouth, his lips slightly parted in a smile she could just barely make out in the light of the moon and street lamps. Temari, he countered, his voice soft, almost teasing her. His breath tickled against her neck. She shivered, her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. She started, but her voice caught in her throat. Temari, Shikamaru repeated, his voice lower this time, barely a murmur from between his teeth. As he leaned in closer, Temari was overwhelmed by the smell of him. Whatever he had been drinking, smoking, of sweat and pine needles. Is this a bad idea? She finally said, her voice still hushed, but her question betrayed her actions as her fingers clasped tighter around his shirt, subconsciously pulling him even closer until his chest was almost touching hers. Maybe. Shikamaru sighed, but didn't pull away. Temari finally looked into his eyes. They were glossy, undoubtedly high, but she sensed there was a bit more behind it. Lust. Wanting. He didn't look away, and neither did she, wondering if the dark pools of his irises could hurt in like a black hole. But I don't care if it is. He closed the distance between them and kissed her. Softly, slowly, carefully, as if he were waiting for her to pull away. I don't care. He whispered against her lips before deepening the kiss as she parted her lips, pulling his hands off the railing beside her and pressing them against her back, pulling her closer. He wasn't sure she could be close enough. Temari melted into him, both of her hands now snaking up his chest and behind his neck, her fingers intertwining and brushing against the hair at the nape of his neck, sending shivers down his spine. She sighed as he pulled away from her, kissing down her cheek, her jaw, her neck, finally burying his face in her shoulder. Shikamaru's arms wrapped around her fully, embracing her. Temari held him in return, not wanting to separate from him. Temari, Shikamaru said, his breath against her neck again and suddenly sounding much more sober than he had just moments before. She loved how he said her name, like it was the only word he knew. Temari cupped his face in her hand as he finally pulled away to look at her again. I know it seems unlike me, but I'm really good at being casual. Either I do all of this or none of it. I know, she said, smiling as she brushed her thumb across his cheek. His skin was still so warm. Then do all of it. With me. Even if it's for a little while. I want to. He trailed off, knowing he was merely prolonging his own heartbreak, knowing that he was fighting the inevitable. It was terribly unrealistic to assume they could carry on, worlds away from one another. We can try. We can try. Temari repeated, seemingly unconvinced as she cleared her throat. He could see the tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, her fingers trembled as she pulled them from his cheeks and laid them back against his chest. She was so gentle and deliberate. He nodded, trying to reassure her, pressing his forehead to hers. Can I? He began, but she quieted him with another kiss. He cupped her face in his hands, the tears that once lined her lashes managed to spill and roll over his fingers. Maybe she was breaking her own heart as well. This was, to some extent, what Shikamaru feared most. Finally allowing themselves a taste of what they had denied themselves for all these years, knowing that it would be fleeting. Knowing that this line they drew in the sand couldn't be uncrossed. But he wanted her for the summer, the night, the moment, any second that he could call her his. Until duty called, and it would be over. Do you want to get out of here? Shikamaru asked as he broke their kiss, breathing heavily almost as if coming up from deep waters for air. His eyes were hooded again, he stared at her lips. We can go back to my place. A little hasty, don't you think? Temari raised an eyebrow but didn't pull her hands off of him, a smile tugging at the ends of her mouth as she roughly wiped the streaks of tears that were left on her cheeks. Not like that, I promise. Shikamaru laughed, standing upright and rubbing the back of his neck. A pink hue returned to his cheeks. Temari recognized it definitively as a blush this time. We have all summer to do this, she said, roping a finger through his belt loop and tugging slightly. His blush deepened almost immediately to a crimson, laughing nervously. Let's just enjoy the party. We can go back to your place another night. Okay. Shikamaru agreed, pausing and looking back to the glass balcony door that still hung open. The sounds from the party still echoing out into the night. There's going to be questions, you know. Kiba doesn't know when to shut his mouth. Let there be questions. I'm not embarrassed, are you? Temari asked, cupping his chin in her hand, brushing her thumb along the corner of his mouth. His skin tingled beneath her touch, he'd light himself on fire if it suited her. He was so ed and he knew it. He gulped, swallowing what little resolve he had left in him. Never. Not of you, he said, his voice low. How could I be? He thought her question to be almost ridiculous. Then be obvious. Who cares? Who cares? He mirrored and he couldn't help but smile widely as she laughed, pulling her into another embrace. He knew how viscerally this would hurt them in the end, how deep this cut would go, and yet, in the moment, he didn't care. She was infectious. She felt like everything he ever wanted. He wanted to fall and fall deep. Temari laced her fingers with his, leading him back through the party and to the kitchen where Sakura, Shino and Kiba were, all three silent as soon as the pair entered. Kiba and Sakura couldn't hide the grins that fell over their faces, though Sakura did make an earnest effort as she covered her growing smile with a closed fist, her eyes glossy. Shino, in typical fashion, remained blissfully unaware of the entire situation and continued to make a drink in the corner of the room, only looking up in confusion after several moments of prolonged silence. Nice, guys, real obvious. Shikamaru said flatly, recognizing their orchestration in leaving the pair alone, but still draped his arm over Temari's shoulder. Temari felt a blush crawl over her cheeks. She hadn't realized how quick he would be to actually be obvious himself. I mean, you practically made me force your hand, man. Kiba said, crossing his arms, leaning back against the refrigerator door. Shikamaru rolled his eyes. I did what needed to be done. What needed to be done? Tenten asked, entering the kitchen, followed shortly thereafter by Neji. Getting these two together, Sakura chimed in, her voice nearly cracking from holding back another fit of giggles. Oh my god. Finally. Tenten nearly shrieked as she pressed her palms to her cheeks and bounced up on her toes. Neji looked to Shikamaru and nodded in acknowledgement, remaining silent. He knew that they would inevitably talk more about the topic later, but their chats were usually in private, much to both of their preferences. Wait, I thought you two were already together? Shino asked, pointing at the two and tilting his head slightly. Sakura deadpanned, raising both hands and shaking her head in confusion at his confusion. How did you bag my sister and be this much of a moron? Kiba groaned, pulling Shino into a headlock and shaking him slightly. Quit it, Shino said before launching a punch into Kiba's side. He stood upright, brushing his hand down his shirt to get rid of the wrinkles before grumbling. Hana thinks it's cute. You guys are really doing too much. Shikamaru said, his voice trailing off as Shino and Kiba continued to bicker, and Tenten, Sakura, and Neji started up an unrelated thread of conversation. He breathed a sigh of relief, looking down to Temari, who met his gaze with bright green orbs. She smiled up at him, pressing a hand to his chest. Her touch gave him goosebumps, or perhaps his skin desperately wanted to rise to meet hers. He was, for the briefest moment, annoyed at how quickly his resolve waned the moment she reciprocated, the second she willingly crossed the invisible barrier they built between them. But how could he be when she looked at him like that? Like a moth to a flame, he was drawn in. Just bad decisions. The walk back was silent, but comfortable. The night was still warm and, oddly enough, the streets were still teeming with life despite the late hour. Shikamaru kept his hands in his pockets, fiddling with his lighter out of habit, and Temari made no attempt at further contact. Crickets hummed loudly, the purple clouds that hung in the distance earlier in the evening now rumbling low with thunder. I'll see you tomorrow, Temari said clearly as she inserted the key into the doorknob, unlocking it with a dull thud before looking up behind her. Shikamaru's expression was soft, but his gaze was penetrating, filled with the same feeling that crept up her spine and twisted through her stomach. Wanting. Her voice softened as she spoke his name. Shikamaru. I've got some work I've been shoving off, but I can come get you for dinner. He said, seemingly disappointed at the persistence of his responsibilities that just continued to stack the longer he remained as an advisor to the Hokage. Temari found it admirable, truly, that as much as he complained about having such responsibilities, he took them quite seriously. Well, as seriously as he was capable of. He yawned, tears stinging at the corners of his eyes. The trees of the 44th training ground loomed overhead. The canopy of leaves not allowing much beyond trickles of sunlight through, yet the flora and fauna beneath its cover thrived, the hum of wildlife echoed around them in complete harmony. It would be quite a beautiful place to kick back and think under the right circumstances, but there wasn't a time nor circumstance during the exams that would allow for such frivolity. The three Jonin slowed their pace as Shino gestured to the ground by his foot, his gaze fixed. Hana leaned down, pressing her fingertips to the outer edge of one of the winding roots that stretched out from a particularly large redwood, seemingly checking the health of the tree, but in a blink of an eye, the nearly undetectable whistle rung out as Hana reached up a hand to grab a kunai midair, just before it plunged into Shino's leg. Seems good to me, Shino mumbled, unmoving and unscathed, his hands remaining in his pockets. His trust in Hana was evident. He pressed his fingers to his facial covering just below his eyes, adjusting the position of his lenses, light reflecting off of them to perfectly mirror Hana's face. Well hidden, Hana replied, as she pushed herself off the ground, brushing the moss and dirt off her knee. She smiled at Shino, the corners of her eyes crinkling before looking to Shikamaru for further confirmation, but I think an observant eye should catch it no problem. You guys have really outdone yourself this year, Shikamaru remarked, glancing around at a number of hidden traps around the forest, some of which hadn't been pointed out directly. He agreed with Hana. Any genin worth promoting should be able to point these out no problem and avoid them with ease, but those who were overconfident and reckless would be in for a rude awakening. Tsunade will be pleased with your preparations. I have one last thing to check, give me a few minutes and we can get out of here. Hana said, jumping back onto one of the upper tree limbs and followed closely by her three dogs. Shino watched Hana carefully as she disappeared into the shadows and out of sight, seemingly lost in thought, before glancing towards Shikamaru and raising an eyebrow. Any good candidates this year? His voice and affect were flat, but this was truthfully the most evidence of genuine interest he'd willingly convey. A few, actually. I'm pretty interested to see how this year plays out. I probably shouldn't take bets again. Kiba still owes me money from last year. Cheap ass. Shino grumbled, pulling out a remarkably thin wallet from his pocket. The gesture made Shikamaru chuckle, something Shino had a knack at. His humor was quite dry, but his timing and quick wit was formidable, often rivaling Shikamaru's. Hana's return broke up their aimless discussion. All right, all set, she shouted, drawing their attention to the canopy above as her dogs yipped playfully. Let's get out of here. You guys go on, I'll check in with Tsunade. I have reports to take care of. Shino and Hana nodded in affirmation, taking their leave to the west through the branches above, leaving Shikamaru to make his way back towards the Hokage mansion. His pace slow, not in any particular rush to return to what he assumed was an endless stack of paperwork. He wasn't as much a fan of being an adult as he thought he would be as a child. After seemingly infinite instances of his father's lectures and mother's incessant scolding, he had naively thought that with time and independence, he could have more autonomy over his day-to-day life. He was sorely mistaken. It was much worse than he could have imagined. Shikamaru, Tsunade greeted as he entered her office. Shikamaru bowed his head in return. How's it looking? Impressive. Hana and Shino really put in their best efforts. Considering our candidate pool, Tsunade said, her eyes moving from him to a number of genin files before her, many of which contained numerous annotations, I have no doubt they'll be up for the challenge. How are they as a pair? My lady, Hana and Shino. Just wondering how they've been working together since I put them to the task last year. Fine, I think. Nothing worth noting. Shikamaru's eyes narrowed slightly. Tsunade was, to her credit, invaluable as a Hokage and leader. She did wonders in the pursuit of advancing the medical affairs of the village, putting forth numerous training programs for medical ninja, personally training the best the village had to offer. She would, and had, laid her life on the line for her people. However, she seldom involved herself into the well-being of those who worked with and for her. Their personal affairs, unless brought to her directly, were something she seemed to care very little about. As such, Shikamaru was skeptical about her line of questioning. It was unlike her to even inquire about a pair or team's functionality, let alone if they seemed to enjoy working together. Good. Tsunade smiled slightly before lacing her fingers together and bringing her hands over her mouth, as if to hide her growing grin. Is she trying to play matchmaker or something? She looked at the clock briefly, closing her eyes and letting out a groan. It's after 5 and I'm late for a meeting with Kaharu. No use in you hanging around here to listen to that old bag drivel on. Don't I have a briefing to write on this? Shikamaru questioned, raising an eyebrow. Shikamaru Nara, are you asking for paperwork? No, no, Shikamaru waved his hands before him, feigning defense as he let out a laugh. I had written one last year, so. Last year we didn't have groundskeepers with Anko stepping down. This year we do. I'll take you at your word. Tsunade spoke as she started digging through one of the drawers in her desk, swearing under her breath as she leaned down into the drawer below it. Do you plan to see Temari anytime soon? I'm sure I'll run into her at some point. Shikamaru said dismissively, almost too dismissively, making every attempt to appear genuine. Make sure she receives these, she said, passing 2 scrolls across her desk to him which he pocketed. Go on. Don't let Kaharu catch you on the way out. Arigato. Shikamaru bowed his head again in gratitude, to which Tsunade waved him away and out of her office, hiding another smile behind a few files she tapped against the desk. Lady Tsunade, Shizune scolded, entering her office just as Shikamaru exited. You're meddling again. Maybe it's my last big mission before I retire, Shizune. Tsunade chucked, before her eyes fell to the photograph of Dan she kept on her desk. She traced the side of his face with her thumb. These kids nearly died for the sake of our village. The least we can do is give them the taste of something we never got to keep. We're just taking it slow. It's not like that, Tenten giggled, covering her mouth with an open hand and waving Temari off. Her eyes were glossy after her second drink. Oh, slow, of course. Is that why you're still wearing the same clothes as last night? Because you're taking it so slow. Temari leaned forward with a raised eyebrow. They were ninja trained in the art of perception and Tenten really thought she could get away with that, unnoticed. I told him someone would notice. She scoffed, her face reddening as she attempted to hide her mock shame by covering her face in her hands, peering at Temari from between her fingers. Her shoulders shook with stifled laughter. I'm actually sort of surprised you two got together, your personalities seem so polarizing. Then again, you are teammates and all. Proximity makes for good bonding time. Temari said, pensive as she pressed a finger to her chin loosely. Tenten's joy was radiating off of her. It was infectious. Are you happy? In love, perhaps? Endlessly so. It's almost embarrassing. She rested her chin against the heel of her hand, her voice dreamy. That's so cute that it's gross. So, what about you and your new lover boy? This conversation was supposed to be about you. Temari said, throwing her straw wrapper at Tenten who merely squinted her eyes, letting it bounce off of her forehead with a giggle. No, no, no. First, you're telling me, Ino, and Sakura that nothing's going on and you're just friends. Next thing we hear you're making out on Kiba's back porch. Tenten pressed on, pushing her finger into the table between them. Temari's eyes narrowed, indicating she was on thin ice. Fine, kissing, I didn't realize we were so prude. So, what gives? I don't know, Temari said, leaning back and crossing her arms, forcing distance between herself and the truth. She wasn't lying, but she didn't have an answer that would make sense to anyone else. It was, by all accounts, an amalgamation of late-night liaison meetings, unacknowledged feelings, and stolen glances that accumulated over the years. It wasn't one thing that changed, it was everything. It just happened. That doesn't just happen. We all knew he was sweet on you but damn. Tenten said, refusing to accept Temari's conversational sidestepping. Sweet on me. Hardly. Oh, shut it, it's so obvious. The second you're in the village, or we even hear the whispers that you might be coming around, he's all smiles. It's actually really adorable. Stop, stop. Don't say that. Temari blushed, covering her cheeks with her hands in a failed attempt to hide it. He's been like this for literally years. He's clearly felt something for a while. Tenten continued, fully aware that she was potentially blowing Shikamaru's long-standing cover of being uninterested and emotionally aloof. So, the question remains, what happened? She really won't let up, will she? Temari thought before letting out a shallow sigh. Her throat was suddenly dry. Nothing really. I think it's always been there. From both sides, if I'm being honest. It just wouldn't work long term and we knew that, so it was easier to deal with the what ifs. But now we're here. He said he wants to try, but I don't think he realizes what that means. I'm away for months at a time, not just from Konoha but from Suna as well. He'd never be able to get a hold of me unless we managed to run into each other, and God knows the next time I'd be able to have a stay here be longer than a day or two. Or a stay anywhere. So, what? We get a weekend together once or twice a year. What kind of relationship is that? It's not fair to him. He deserves someone who's around. He deserves someone who makes him happy. Tenten countered in an attempt at moral support. I think what would make him happy is not having to worry about where I am, what I'm doing, if I'm okay. He wants an easy life. He deserves an easy life. Temari replied. To some extent, she found her actions to be merciful. Protective. She wouldn't subject him to a life of worry. A life of lost opportunities because he was waiting for her. What Shikamaru wants and how he acts are in contradiction. Tenten replied, widening her eyes slightly as if to indicate she knew more, but avoided eye contact to swirl her straw in the melting ice of her consumed drink. I'm not sure what you mean. Temari stated, shaking her head slightly in confusion. If he wanted something uncomplicated, he'd have pursued someone else. He chose you, maybe give him that autonomy to make his own decisions. Tenten said, fiddling with the straw wrapper that Temari had tossed at her. Temari didn't respond, looking down at her hands resting in her lap, suddenly consumed with the memory of his fingers intertwined with hers. You don't need to martyr yourself. He's a big boy, he can make the call that's best for him. Maybe you're best for him, distance or not. When did this become a pep talk? You know, I had a chat with Naruto when I first got into town. In his own way, he told me that the hurdles I'm facing were self-imposed and that maybe they weren't that difficult to overcome, which is probably how I got myself into this mess to begin with. I get what he's saying, it just feels impossible. Tenten finished her sentence, her stare unwavering. Trust me, I know the feeling. Do you know how deeply entrenched the Hyuga family is in tradition? And me, coming from a no-name family, it was almost like treason to be with me. I thought we'd be sneaking around indefinitely. At least until he was married off for political reasons. Yet, Hiyashi agreed at Neji's persistence. Sometimes the hurdles are self-imposed. How do you know if they're insurmountable if you don't try? Tenten grabbed Temari's hands in hers, making an effort to comfort Temari who, much to her own shock, felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes. She was frustrated, almost angry, that this situation was drawing so many emotions out of her. It was so unlike her to feel much at all. Go all in. At the end of all this, if you realize that this is too much, then you know. You tried your best, and you can walk away without regrets. Sometimes that's life. Sometimes that's life. Temari mirrored. Shit. Temari cursed and let out a long sigh, looking at the folded note left pushed into the doorframe. It was late, much later than she thought it had been when she initially left Tenten's place following their exit from the restaurant. She unfolded the note to see just an address. The hiragana letters were lazily written, the pen dragging over the paper between characters. Even his handwriting was languorous and discernibly his. She smiled, though felt terribly guilty for effectively standing him up. The moon hung low, the glow casting narrow, elongated shadows over the village. She had been to his home just one another time, never entering the compound gates but merely waiting for him outside. It was as she had remembered from all those years ago, though perhaps much more overgrown than memory served. Pulling at the ivy that grew over the lock, the gate swung open with a long, nearly ear-piercing squeal that gave her goosebumps. Closing it behind her, she sighed almost in relief as she realized the moonlight would be enough to help her navigate through the winding path. If I don't get myself lost in these damn woods, Temari silently scolded herself. She walked with some trepidation, chewing on her bottom lip as the tips of her toes searched the ground between each step to ensure she wasn't going to trip or walk into something invisible in the night. Temari was on edge but wasn't quite able to place why, perhaps out of guilt due to her lateness, but also because she was expecting to spend the night. Yet again, another boundary she had chosen time and time again not to cross with him. Closeness, overlapping the more intimate moments of their lives, sleep included. Yet, here she was, flagrantly dancing across that boundary. Another long sigh escaped her lips, though her breath caught in her throat as a doe meandered out of the brush and stopped just next to her. Holy, she pressed a hand loosely to her chest, can't believe you snuck up on me like that. The deer bowed slightly, dipping its head low as if to greet her. Temari returned the bow with a giggle, wondering when the wildlife in Konoha had gotten so polite or if this was exclusive to the Nara deer. With an extended hand, she crouched down slightly to allow the doe to smell her. A couple of deep inhales, followed by the deer pressing her forehead into her hand, much like a dog in desperate for affection would. Suddenly, she felt filled with childlike wonder. She had never been so close to a doe before, let alone been able to scratch behind its ears. Not even the street cats in Suna would venture so close, yet this deer was more than happy to approach her. They usually don't like visitors. A voice broke through the silence. Low and graveled, laced with sleepiness. Temari looked up to him before turning away almost instantly, her cheeks burning. His hair was down from its usual tie, loosely brushing against his very much uncovered shoulders and back. His hands pressed into the pockets of his pants. I don't think I've ever been this close to one, Temari said, making a sordid effort to keep her focus on the animal before her and not the shirtless man standing beside her. Shikamaru hummed, giving her a few quiet moments to take in the experience. He remembered the first time his old man had taken him to feed the deer. He was barely a toddler, yet the memory lingered. One of many. I missed you, earlier, he said, though he seemed to immediately recognize how it sounded and corrected himself. I wasn't sure if you were still out. I just lost track of time with Tenten. I'm sorry, I should have been paying better attention. Temari was earnest in her apology, finally returning her gaze to his. His eyes were soft, gentle, as if he were soaking in her image. She blushed deeply, hoping the low light disguised it, though she was fairly certain it didn't as he smiled softly as she did so. It's fine, he said through a long, exaggerated yawn. He turned on his heels, hands still folded in his pockets as he slowly walked towards his home. It's late. It is, Temari agreed, her feet taking her in the same direction. He didn't ask her to follow, but he didn't need to. She waved goodbye to the doe, who bowed again before returning beyond the tree line. His home was almost unnervingly quiet. The floorboards softly creaked beneath their footsteps, the crickets, songs beyond the walls quietly echoed through the main room. The dim light of the candles cast an orange hue over the pair. He continued on down the hallway, the dim light fading into pitch darkness the further they walked. Instinctively, Temari reached for his hand, which he readily clasped around hers as he opened a door at the end of the hall. The bathing blue glow of moonlight shone through the many windows of the room. Temari's eyes adjusted quickly. She observed him as he dug through the drawers of a wardrobe, the muscles in his back and shoulders tense, his skin riddled in scars Temari hadn't seen before. Not that she had spent much more a moment or two really looking at him. In her endless efforts to keep herself at arm's length, she realized that she would often avoid looking at him for too long. She refused to remember his crooked smile, the way he'd tap his fingertips together when he was too lost in his own head, how his nose crinkled when he got angry. Temari realized just how desperately she wanted to know him, all of him. Shikamaru pulled something from the drawers that she couldn't quite make out, interrupting her train of thought. What's this for? Temari asked as Shikamaru turned back to her and pressed a few articles of clothing into her hands. Are you sleeping in what you're wearing? Am I sleeping over? She teased through a smile, unfolding the shirt and shorts that were much too large for her. I'm going to sleep. What you do is up to you. He sighed, his eyes hazy and on the edge of returning to sleep, following her as she slipped back out of the room, clothes in hand. The door creaked slightly as she returned, though seemingly in just the shirt as she threw the shorts and her worn yukata over the chair that tucked into his desk. Too big, she mumbled, sitting down on the edge of his bed. Temari, Shikamaru spoke, his voice barely above a whisper as he watched her silhouette slowly pull out the ties around her buns, letting the blonde hair fall to her shoulders. He propped himself on his elbow as she finished the last one, leaning over and wrapping his arm around her waist before pulling her towards the center of the bed. Come here. He pulled her frame down and pressed her back into his bare chest, curling his arm around her waist to hold her close. His hand managed to find its way under her shirt, pressing his palm against the skin of her ribcage. Heat cooled off of him. He let out a sigh, seemingly relaxing into her, his breath hot against the back of her neck managed to still give her goosebumps. Temari stirred slightly, but his grasp on her was firm. He left soft kisses against her shoulder and neck, his lips barely ghosting against her skin. His thumb gently stroked against her rhythmically. Tenten stood at the sink, rinsing out the two-stemmed glasses faintly stained pink with the last drops of red wine. She glanced behind her as the front door opened and shut, quiet, measured footsteps approaching from the corridor. Neji rounded the corner, seeming to just notice that she was still awake and resting his shoulder against the kitchen doorway. Hey, Tenten spoke softly, flicking the water from the bottom of the glasses into the sink before hanging them to dry. Still awake, HN? Neji questioned, raising his open hands up towards her as she walked into his arms, wrapping her own around his waist loosely and resting her cheek against his chest with a sigh. He hummed in contentment as he delicately pulled the ties from the twin buns on her head, letting her chestnut-colored hair spill over his fingers and down her back. He cradled the back of her head in his hands, kissing her temple as he did so. How is Lady Temari? Good, good. It was nice to catch up, just us. It's been a while, years maybe. She said, finally pulling away to look up at him with a smile. His eyes softened as he looked into hers, fingers delicately tracing her jaw before falling back to his sides. She seems a little overwhelmed with everything, you know. HN. How so? Neji asked as he walked further into the kitchen, leaning back against the counter and gently tugging at the wrappings around his hands. Tenten knew that he didn't particularly care to hear about the personal affairs of others unless they wanted to speak to him directly, but seemed aware that she wanted to mull over their conversation, and so he would humor her. Well, you know how Shikamaru obviously has had feelings for Temari for some time, and Temari said it was always mutual, but that she was also always worried, I suppose. Tenten said, slowly lowering herself into a seat at the dining table, propping her feet up on the seat and wrapping her arms around her knees. She's obviously a liaison for Gaara and she's always traveling or on some sort of bodyguard duty all the time. She's been hesitant to start a relationship and have it all fall apart because she can never be around. The heart wants what it wants, I guess. Neji hummed again, acknowledging her side of the conversation and appearing to think on his next words carefully as he pulled a kettle and 2 cups from the cabinets to begin making tea. Tenten watched him, his movements so calm, collected, relaxed. Comfortable. She felt at peace with him, his presence was grounding. Lady Temari's political duties seem to be important to her and she is quite close to her brothers. I am sure she feels an immense obligation not only to her village, but to them as well. A difficult decision for her to make, between her loyalties and whatever life she may want for herself, in Konoha, or otherwise. Neji finally spoke after several moments of silence, sitting down in the seat across from Tenten and placing his carefully re-spun hand wrappings onto the table before him. He leaned into the back of the chair and closed his eyes, allowing himself the chance to rest. It hurts to see her so torn up over it. Tenten sighed and fiddled with the empty teacup before her. I just want her to be happy. To see them at odds with the universe, I guess. You are a good friend. Neji reassured her, peering at the kettle through squinted eyes before closing them again. So, Tenten redirected, pressing her hand over his. How was it with Naruto? Fine. His Monsuki still needs to be fitted, but he is as prepared for the ceremony as I could have expected him to be. Neji stated, his voice flat, but he seemed to be at ease with the idea of his cousin marrying someone as hard-headed as Naruto. He flipped his hand over to cup her palm in his, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. And Hinata. She was with Lady Hanabi most of the night. I did not see her until I was readying to leave. Is she excited? Quite. I'm glad. Weddings are so lovely. I bet she's over the moon. Tenten covered her mouth as she spoke through a yawn, suddenly overcome with sleepiness. Neji hummed again, pressing her hand to his cheek, just to feel her touch. She watched his eyes gloss over, the lavender hue beautiful in the candlelight. His brow tensed slightly, deep in thought. The kettle began to whistle. The sound of her heartbeat bumped rhythmically, slowly, against his ears. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. It was soft, slow, punctuated only slightly by the quiet, deep breaths she took as she slept. He pressed the bridge of his nose into the space between her neck and jaw, breathing her in. Jasmine, vanilla, salt. His hand still cupped against her ribs, slowly brushing his thumb against the skin that seemed to raise with goosebumps at every touch. Shikamaru found yet another moment he wanted to live in eternally. He seemed to be having a lot of those lately. Temari stirred slightly, leaning her head against his and sighing. Her hand raised to his forearm, grasping it gently before falling limp again. He wanted to sleep longer, but the blue hue of the impending sunrise hung over them through the skylight of his room, and it was more effective at waking him than even the loudest of alarm clocks. The morning doves cooed, their melancholic song echoing around the compound. They reminded him of his childhood, waking up early with his father to feed the deer and catch frogs in the ponds with Choji. When life was simpler, easier. He smiled against Temari's neck at the thought. He was grateful that the memories of his childhood were ones worth remembering. Shikamaru rose quietly from the bed, careful not to wake Temari, who remained sound asleep, and pulled a blanket over her. He studied her face, her features relaxed, soft, beautiful. The sight pained him, to an extent, knowing that he couldn't stop time. That inevitably his bed would be empty again. He stretched as he slid open and exited the back door of the main room, yawning as he was greeted by the sunrise before him. A pink and orange glow now washed over the pond, the lone crane taking flight after noticing his sudden presence. The reeds shook slightly as a breeze passed through, sending gentle ripples over the water and disturbing the clear image of the koi just below the surface. His favorite time of day was the split second after the sun broke over the horizon, sending cascading streaks of light into the air, coloring the clouds a deep purple. He wasn't sure how long he had stood there, soaking in the scene before him. Long enough for the heat of summer to begin creeping up again, humidity from the morning dew clinging to the air. Morning, Temari spoke from behind him, her voice laced with sleepiness as she s her arms around his waist, pressing her hands against his chest and her cheek against his bare back. She let out a long sigh, relaxing into him. Shikamaru blushed as he held his hands over hers, humming to greet her. Did I wake you? He asked, his voice low. No, but I can't seem to sleep much past dawn anyway. Plus, I'd miss the view, she said as she dropped her hands from his chest, sidestepping to stand next to him to take in the sunrise as well. Shikamaru draped his arm over her shoulder as she leaned her head against him. He was relieved that it was so easy with her. Much easier than he had imagined it to be, and he had often imagined despite his best efforts. It was so easy to drop the act, the forced distance and disinterest, pretending that he didn't care. Regrettably, he cared much more than he had ever intended to. He liked having her around in a way he didn't like much else. No sunrises back home, he mused after a moment, raising an eyebrow as he looked down at her. Temari rolled her eyes and clicked her tongue in annoyance. Well, mostly easy. They look different everywhere I go, she said slowly, as if lost in thought, blue-green orbs transfixed on the scenery before them. They stood in silence for another few moments, taking in the slowness of nature as she woke from her slumber, the calm of the night making way for the celebration of daybreak. Did you want tea? He asked as he dropped his arm from her shoulder to her hand, and began backing towards the door. Yes, please. She laughed as he pulled her inside behind him. Shikamaru watched from behind the kitchen counter as she analyzed the interior of the compound, observing it in daylight for the first time. He had made some effort to keep it clean and keep the majority of his messes to his bathroom and bedroom. Not that he often had company, but he appreciated the segregation of peace and chaos. He cleaned the living area and shogi room the most, taking care to keep it as free of dust and clutter as possible so that he had at least one space free of noise, as he thought it. As he readied the kettle, he watched her eyes gloss over the pictures of his parents on the walls, from their wedding, from their respective childhoods, and from Shikamaru's all through his promotion to Jonin. It was, to some extent, like a time capsule. There were no pictures after that point. As if time stopped, and perhaps for him it did. Arigato. Temari acknowledged as he handed her a tall teacup filled with an earthy, reddish-brown tea, 2 cubes of sugar and a small spoon in the saucer beneath it. She followed him back out the door, the sun nearly completely breached over the horizon and the morning humidity increasing by the second. Shikamaru could feel sweat gather at the back of his neck. Anything for Mari. Shikamaru mused again, closing the door behind them with a push of his foot. Mari, huh? She questioned flatly as she lowered the cup and then herself to the edge of the decked walkway, kicking her legs over the edge and swinging her feet. Shikamaru studied her expression, unsure if she was annoyed at the nickname or merely amused. He could see a smirk tug at the corner of her lips and felt himself relax a bit. Too much. He laughed, placing the teacup next to hers and lowering himself onto his feet on the ground below, leaning back against the edge of the deck. Tiny bit. She raised her cup to her lips and took a long sip to hide her growing smile. Not very creative. And I can't call you baby. Gross. Temari laughed, her nose crinkling as she expressed her displeasure. My girl. Shikamaru feigned exasperation as he spoke, rubbing the sweat from the back of his neck and tilting his head as he looked at her, a sly grin creeping across his face. He refused to lose this game of cat and mouse. He loved the thrill of the chase too much to back down now. Your girl, she countered, emphasizing the ownership implied in the phrase. She leaned back on her hands, raising an eyebrow, but she hadn't managed to hide her cheeks flushing. Something she'd blame on the heat if he pressed her on it, he was sure. My girl, he cooed, stepping closer so that his legs were barely between hers, his hands planted firmly in his pockets in his rapidly failing attempt to keep his composure. I don't know if you've made me your girl, yet. Her voice low, graveled. Sexy, if Shikamaru weren't too intent on getting her to fold to notice it. He was desperate to call her something, if only for a short time, if only for a little while, no matter how selfish. Mine, 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 his thoughts teased him with his innate desire to have her be his, and he hers. Do you want to be my girl? He asked, stepping closer, pressing his thighs against the deck between her legs, his eyes unwavering. He rested his hands on either side of her, leaning close. I'll think about it, Temari replied, holding his gaze, her smile devilish and enticing. She bit down against her bottom lip as she squeezed her thighs against his. He felt like he was seeing stars. Think harder. He pressed, unable to take his eyes off her lips. The air felt hot and electric, like moments before an explosion. Shikamaru feared that his calculations were wrong, that he wasn't a moth to a flame, he was the flame. She was the accelerant. And he wanted to be accelerated. Convince me. He didn't need to be told twice. He closed the distance between them, capturing her lips in his. His hands up her neck, his thumb brushing over her throat, which was met with a soft sigh, her lips parting just enough to deepen the kiss as his tongue brushed past and into her mouth. Temari's legs wrapped around his waist, pulling herself against his growing erection. His hand moved swiftly, grasping her and pulling her even closer, making her gasp against his mouth. Her hands grazed against his stomach, sending a shiver ran up his spine, then dropping low and beginning to pull at the drawstring of his pants painfully slowly. His mouth and tongue were desperate now, hungry. He wanted her madly. He drug his hand up from her to pull away her bra, cupping her in his hands and grazing his thumb over her exposed nipple, eliciting another gasp from her. Shikamaru felt her hand drop further, pulling at the hem of his pants and dropping them lower on his hips, making his hips buck against her involuntarily. He felt intoxicated and touch-starved. He needed her. He pulled his lips away from hers, his mouth trailing down her jaw, his tongue flicking over tanned skin before biting against her neck, drawing a soft moan from deep within her. It felt deeply animalistic, laying his claims like this, but her fingernails dug into his shoulder and he couldn't help but want more of her. All of her. The loud chime of an alarm clock rung from behind the walls of room behind them. The pair froze for a moment, pulling away to look at one another with a shocking amount of incredulity for something so incredibly mundane. Damn it! He hissed, through his teeth against Temari's neck, which rumbled slightly with the choking back of laughter, seeming to enjoy the endless tease. She kissed his temple, drawing her fingernails down his arm until her fingers laced with his against the deck beneath them. The alarm clock continued to ring, the tone getting louder, louder, louder still, beckoning him to start his morning routine. I have to go, stay here. Please. I'll be back this afternoon. Shikamaru pulled himself away from her, his touch lingering against her thighs. He brought his hands to her face, squeezing her cheeks as he pressed a rough kiss against her forehead before bounding inside. Temari let out a loud laugh at his tone change, standing to follow him through the doorway. He scrambled through drawers in a mad dash to get ready, jumping from his pajama pants and into his typical uniform. Throwing his undershirt on, then taking it off again to turn it outside in and continue through his rush. She couldn't help but giggle.